I had two main concerns with Nordhold when I played the Next Fest demo. First, I was worried that it wasn't unique enough, and second, I was worried that the progression style might ruin the game balance and pacing. Fortunately, I actually think both those concerns were mostly addressed with the full release, and I've had a great time playing Nordhold, so let's get into it. Nordhold is a tower defense roguelite where you defend your town from waves of enemies. Your town has management and city building elements, while a gameplay area has a series of hex grid tiles that are revealed one wave at a time. Within each larger area, there are smaller hex grid tiles where you actually place each tower. There are 8 different tower types, each of them have different attack patterns, some focusing on strong single target damage, like a slow hitting Raven tower, while others focusing more on AoE, like the Lightning tower that has attacks that can jump between enemies to deal more damage. As you reveal a new area with each wave, you'll find randomized tile height that can give your towers more range, as well as a randomized enemy path, with some having more winding turns than others. Choosing which towers to place where is a very familiar strategic element of tower defense games, and it's also nicely present here. As I mentioned in my Next Fest video, this core loop feels very similar to Rogue Tower. Towers in Nordhold have 2 different ways to be upgraded. First are individual tower upgrades, which can be purchased directly with gold, but that upgrade cost also naturally decreases with each wave, meaning that you can naturally get tower upgrades without ever spending any resources as you progress further and further. There are also like 10 different ways you can upgrade individual towers, ranging from pure damage increases to crit chance to extra barrier damage for enemies that have that. This would be very annoying to micromanage for each tower, but thankfully there are a lot of tools to help with that, like being able to create upgrade templates you can use for all towers of the same type with only a couple of clicks. I'm sure there are some mathematically best upgrade paths for certain towers, but I usually went with the more lazy approach. And on that note of control, you can find similar control over targeting options, ranging from simple ones like first enemy or most health, to more complicated ones like the largest cluster of enemies or attacking enemies until they die as opposed to retargeting every shot. Tower defense games certainly don't require this level of granular control and upgrading, but I liked it here, and I'm glad it's there for Nordhold. And just as importantly, I'm glad that it's so easy to manage with templates and such to avoid being tedious. The second way that towers are upgraded is also one of the main actual roguelite twists on the game. Between waves, and occasionally through other rewards, you can draft banners, which are rewards that affect all towers of the same type. For example, arrow towers are the fast shooting but lower damage towers, and banners that affect arrow towers can cause them to fire additional arrows or deal a new bleed effect that slows and damages enemies over time. There are also more basic banners that just increase your firing rate or damage in a more straightforward way. More uniquely, there are rare legendary banners that give some powerful buffs for certain towers, and there are fusion banners. Arc towers are another tower type that have lightning attacks that jump from enemy to enemy to get additional hits in. One arc tower and arrow tower fusion makes arrows have a similar effect, where they jump between enemies if placed next to an arc tower. Those fusions allow for just some more fun combos and help add great variety with those specific pairings. It's worth noting that only specific tower pairings can allow for fusion banners. Each tower can only have fusion banners with up to 3 other towers. I guess that's fine, but it just feels like a weird exclusion to me to not have fusion banners for all possible tower pairings because that would just be more fun. Another strategic element is that towers cost more and more as you build more of them. That means that cost-wise, it might be better to build a number of different towers as opposed to only one tower type, so you don't get punished and hit with extreme building costs as you build more and more of one tower. But as we talked about, those banners are incredibly powerful upgrades that only affect one tower type. So having more of that one tower type makes each of those banners more impactful because it affects more of your towers. Additionally, you can only get banners for towers that you've placed. So if you only place arrow towers, it's really easy to focus on those and get more arrow banners. While placing even one volcano or arc tower might dilute that banner pool, though we'll talk about some ways to counteract that later on. I liked all the strategy elements around upgrading towers, and I really like the balancing elements between getting different types of towers versus doubling down on a smaller number of tower types. I usually focused on 2 or 3 tower types to get that nice mix of cost savings from different towers, while still having that compounding and doubling down potential from banners. I also usually focused on at least 2 towers that had fun fusion banners because I just like playing around with those. All that so far is focused on the tower side of Nordhold, but one of the more unique gameplay elements actually comes in the economic management and city management side of the game. I don't think I've ever seen a tower defense game with an attached city building economic element, let alone one that's so impactful and so central to the gameplay. At its core, between waves you're managing a city of workers, various buildings, and an economy of 4 different resources. You have wood, which is used for buildings and a couple towers, stone, which is important for all but one tower, grain, which is mainly used for hiring more workers and other worker buffs, and finally gold, which is used for both town upgrades and upgrading towers. Unlike most other tower defense games that have a single currency for towers, here, having different currencies gives different strategy elements to focus on. It also gives different points for relics to interact with. It also leads to interesting choices around what towers you want to choose. An easy starting combo to focus on is arrow and volcano towers because they only cost wood and stone respectively, while combo volcano and tornado towers might require a larger focus on stone since both of them only cost stone. Along with that, you're constantly balancing investing in economic elements with buying more towers and tower upgrades. You're balancing that future economic power while trying not to die early because you didn't buy enough towers. This plays into both short-term purchases, like how do I spend my wood this turn, and more long-term purchases, like investing into grain, which is purely an economic-focused resource. And that way, even though it's way simpler than RTS games, it nicely channels some of that economic energy and gave me those same feelings of sneaking by with a large economic investment that paid off with having more towers and upgrades long term. And also conversely times when I got absolutely crushed because I had strong economic tunnel vision and neglected actually building towers. That tension and balancing act felt really great to learn. As more gameplay odds and ends, you can also place outposts on tiles to harvest nearby resources or buff nearby towers. You can also collect relics that have various passive buffs. These are usually more economic focused, like increasing resource found on future tiles, but they also have more pure buffs, like increasing all tower damage. You can also get a hero that has different passive effects, as well as 2 active spells that can damage enemies. And there are expeditions you can send workers on to occasionally get rewards. There are a lot of smaller mechanics here and there like that come from different individual buildings. It's not quite a bloated game, but it's definitely brushing up against that with these number of little elements that kind of exist in isolation. I did try this game on Steam Deck as well, and it runs fine. It doesn't have native controller support though, so if you're using the default controls, it's the trackpad as a mouse. It works okay for the most part, but some of the controls require precise movement due to small UI, like pausing waves, for example, and that was kind of annoying to navigate. On that note, you can always pause during waves to build towers and things like that. You can also increase the game speed up to 4x, which is great. And for me personally, game speed options in tower defense games are basically a must for me to actually play them these days. On top of that, I did have some occasional bugs during my time with the pre-release version. Notably, I had one bug which made me not able to cast spells for some waves, and that was obviously frustrating because these spells can be pretty powerful. I had another bug that affected my pre-run starting buffs. Usually you have 4 options, but I could only choose 2. These bugs were fairly uncommon and usually not game-breaking outside of that spell bug that I had for a little bit. Additionally, I did have some stuttering in my game when I got to super late game waves, especially in that endless mode, which I'll talk about later. Wasn't the end of the world, but I do have a pretty good PC, so I think it's just the overwhelming number of enemies and effects stacking up. This happens a lot in tower defense games when things get crazy, but still worth mentioning. As a whole, I think Nordhold builds on a familiar tower defense core by adding some unique twists of banners and economic management. And I think it's that economic management aspect that really takes this game from one that I felt lukewarm on initially to one that I actually quite enjoyed because that core gameplay loop is fun, and I really enjoy trying to optimize run to run. Now let's talk about variety and randomness in Nordhold. The different towers are the most obvious initial element for run-to-run variety. These towers do all feel different from each other, different attack speeds, different AoE effects, and different debuffs or conditions they apply like slows or stuns. While you can place all 8 towers in every run, because of the banners, I usually found myself only focusing on a couple of them. But you can choose which ones you want to actually focus on. There are some gameplay nudges and restrictions on that, like being hard to win a game with only Raven towers, or certain tower combos having fusion banners while other ones don't. But it's ultimately still completely in your hands which towers you want to play. That means that you can do arrow and volcano tower runs every single time if you want to do that, or you can never play those towers at all if you hate them. Basically, this big element of variety is fully decided by you near the start of your run, though you might shift over time based on banners and preference. Usually banners are a choice out of 3 options. Each tower might have up to 10 different possible banners, each of which come in different tiers. It can also be continually upgraded over time. For example, one volcano tower banner gives it a burning tile effect that can be found at different tiers that have higher base damage, or it can be upgraded with additional banners for that same effect. Higher tier banners are notably more powerful than lower tier ones, so that RNG is impactful there. But the game also gives you a lot of control over banners. One building upgrade, for example, lets you always have at least one banner option of your preferred tower type. so you can always force at least one arrow tower banner if that's what you want to focus on. Second, the game gives very generous rerolls and banishes, which prevent a banner from being offered again on that run. And finally, there just aren't that many actual different banner options. So if you're focusing on arrow towers, you will eventually be offered that banner that gives the bleed effect on hit if that's something that you want. I do wish that all these tower types had more types of banners. Right now, it feels like each tower has 2 or occasionally 3 different build paths. The Arc Tower, for example, has a focus on single unit crit damage, as well as a focus on attacks that jump between enemies. So you can lean more into one of those styles based on what banners you get. But if you're running an Arc Tower focused build that run, you're always going to get a little bit of both of those paths. So that makes different runs feel more similar, even if you have different focuses. That limitation on banner variety is one of the reasons that I started to focus on trying all the different fusion banners that I could. Those fusion banners led to more unique combos, different strategies that were fun, and felt like they actually forced me to adapt and play a different way than I normally would without them. On the other hand, focusing on crits versus jumps for my Arc Tower didn't really force me to play differently. So I think the banner variety had potential to add more impactful run-to-run variety than it actually did. Another variety element came from the different heroes. Each hero has their respective spells and passives that are always randomized run to run. I quite like the spell variety, and I felt like they had some nice different focuses, like some focusing on single target damage, some on AoE damage. Others are indirect tower buffs, like debuffing enemies that allow them to take more damage from towers. I will say though that because of how spell upgrading works, I usually just double down on one spell per run and spam that single spell a couple times during each wave. The final large area of the build are the relics that I mentioned. Similar to banners, these are usually choose one out of 2 or 3 options type of situation, but there are also times you can buy them from merchants directly. Similar to most banners, they didn't usually change how I actually played, but there were a couple notable exceptions that did exist, like ones that stack some effect if you waited waves to spend gold. Economically, your town management is pretty minimally impacted by RNG. Drawing back on the RTS analogy, I felt like I dabbled in different openings before I settled on one standard opening that became my general strategy. I basically always bought the same 10 things in the same order every single run once I kind of figured out what I wanted to do. Of course, you don't have to do that, and sometimes things like additional starting resources or a free building might change my opening, but the first few waves of the game became incredibly standardized to me over time. And I'm sure you could crunch the numbers on which early upgrades are the most efficient and kind of settle on a most efficient starting path. Past those early waves, things definitely open up and change a lot though. Because different towers require different resources, the choice of what towers you want to focus on will quickly impact your economy as well. While wood and grain are great for building up your workers quickly, if you're going to focus on towers that use stone, you can't delay building up and upgrading that stone quarry as well. Additionally, there are a lot of different systems that allow you to gain gold, so depending on what resource you're focusing on, you might choose to focus on different methods of gold gain. At late game stages though, I think the branching paths yet again converge in a way where you basically buy all the buildings and buy all of their upgrades. There are still 2 late game mechanics that add some more variety, notably research trees, which are basically skills trees that you can upgrade across different waves that buff different economic and different tower aspects. And there are also building specializations, which are basically upgrades for each building where you choose between 2 options. These can be pretty impactful and powerful, though again, it feels like it can be mathematically optimized. You can always choose the same ones in the same order. So as a whole, there are a lot of different paths and different ways to focus on things with the economic and city building management. But while I love the risk reward, the economic management gameplay wise, it has some flaws variety wise. The main problem is that there are a few things in this game that really force you to engage with the economy in different ways, outside of the very basic focusing on different towers that have different resource costs. And further, because it feels like there's a mathematically best opening for 90% of your runs, it can feel a little unsatisfying over time, and I felt disincentivized to try different openings that just felt worse to me. Even some late game sources of variety can feel similar, or it just feels like some are notably more powerful than others, and you can always do the same specializations or research tree each run if you want to. So, yet again, a lot of that run-time variety is self-driven as opposed to being forced to adapt to what the game gives you. The final element of run-to-run variety comes in the enemies and the tile or map layout. It's worth noting that the enemies themselves spawn in the same ways in a reliable manner to the best that I can tell. Every wave 5 is the same set of enemies. There is a small randomized element, and that's if you get elite enemies, and they're basically mini-bosses that give you an extra reward. That's an appreciated twist, but it's not a massive source of variety either. The enemies themselves have different qualities and passive. Some are faster, some are slower with more health, and some spawn additional enemies when killed. Some also have barrier that shields nearby enemies, and some have armor that gives them a chance to negate attacks on them. All of these qualities encourage you to have some tower variety, or at least some focus on both single target damage and AoE damage. One thing the game doesn't have is a hard counter system, which I initially thought it did. There are different types of elemental damage and things like that, but there's nothing like X damage deals Y% more damage to a certain enemy type. There's just that soft counter system where certain towers are a little better on certain enemy types. I think this enemy variety is good enough. There are enough different enemy types with occasional elite enemies and the more powerful bosses on certain waves that it feels nice, but it's just not a big selling point, especially because these waves are basically the same run to run as well. The map itself is an interesting source of RNG because your path is determined by where the next area happens to spawn, and there can be randomized branching as well. Some paths might make a large straight line away from your castle, while others might curve back around. This, yet again, reminds me of maps in Rogue Tower, which frustrated me because curved maps and curved paths were way easier than straight paths. Because that curving allowed for towers to just attack the enemies more often, attack them at 2 different points along their path. I think Nordhold balances it better though. For one, the curve and path itself within each large hex grid area is more randomized, and that allows for more varied and satisfying tower placement, regardless of the overall pathing. And two, once a path branches, you can choose to focus more on the curved path or more on the straight path to get further. While the curved path had the advantage of more increased range or time enemies are attackable by a single tower, the further away areas allow you to find unique tile passive effects that can boost tower range, tower damage, or damage to barrier. In that sense, there's almost a bit of a trade-off between going for those tile buffs and getting that more native attack range advantage. It makes the RNG feel more balanced because both curved paths and straight paths have their own advantages. So as a whole, I think there are a lot of small RNG choices and mechanics that add variety run to run, from banners to relics to expeditions to map and tile layout, things like that. These all made for fun choices and small differences here and there. But in actual broad strokes, a lot of the run-to-run variety is focused on what choices you want to make, like what towers you want to focus on, what building or economic mechanics you want to use. And because of that, the game has a notable risk of being consistently optimized in a way that limits long-term replayability for me personally. Now let's talk about progression and replayability in Nordhold. There are 2 main progression systems, Honor and some hidden experience system. Honor is the currency you get by just completing runs, and you get more honor as you get to further waves and get new high scores. You can use honor to buy upgrades for future runs, like increased starting resources, or the option to allow more in-run upgrades for your building. This is also how you unlock all the additional tower types, because you only start with 1 tower unlocked. The other main progression system is a hidden experience or leveling system. I couldn't quite figure out how it worked because it was hidden, but as you play more, you unlock more buildings and more mechanics that you can use on future runs. At the start, you only had half or so of the total buildings unlocked, and this leveling up unlocks the rest of them, as well as abilities to buy more upgrades with honor. Like the honor resource, you unlock more of these things by just playing the game and getting further. Together, these 2 systems add a lot new buffs and a lot of new mechanics to the game. Basically, all these upgrades are also vertical progression that make you more powerful run to run, especially the upgrades that are bought with honor. The new building and building upgrades that were unlocked were usually more indirect, but still vertical progression. They added some new economic paths, which were some variety, but they also just made it easier to get resources. For example, it's initially hard to get gold because you can only get it from a tower upgrade in the gold mine, which requires allocating some of your limited pool of workers. But as you get more upgrades unlocked, gold becomes much easier to acquire. You can buy trading ships with wood that passively get gold each wave. You can buy a gold mine upgrade that does the same thing. And you can build a guild hall, which allows you to get increasing amounts of gold each wave until you withdraw it. All these options make gold a much easier resource to acquire compared to when you first start, where it's very hard to get. When I played the demo last month, I was really worried this progression would kind of ruin the game by being too heavy-handed. And I don't think it actually did, mostly because the pacing felt really good for me, and because it unlocked a lot of new things over time, as opposed to just solely buffing things. There are so many different small mechanics that were unlocked, usually which correspond to a certain building. This slow unravel and reveal over time made learning all these mechanics much easier, though again, they all came with varying degrees of vertical progression, so things are notably easier when you've unlocked all of them. It's also worth saying that vertical progression is almost exclusively on the economic side of the game, which I also think improved it for me. It meant that I was constantly iterating on my opening strategy, what I wanted to prioritize as I unlocked more buildings, without feeling a sense of having artificially weak towers, which is what I was worried about and what I thought might ruin the progression if it was more focused on directly buffing towers. Of course, progression is always a matter of preference, but I think the pacing here is quite well done. And this game never felt grindy or anything like that. I also got everything unlocked around 11 hours or so, which is just not that long for roguelite progression trees. Difficulty-wise, this game has two main systems. In order to actually beat the run, you must beat the final boss at the end of wave 30. As the first difficulty option, you can play on an endless mode, where you get infinite waves until you lose. I found this endless mode to be more satisfying than others, and there's a leaderboard as well where you can compete and see how far you can go. You can also choose to end your run at wave 30 and have it count as a win. I think wave 30 is the right ending point for this game economically because that's where you start to basically max out all building upgrades, which makes the economic management side of things boring or effectively non-existent because you're no longer making choices. And after you win, either ending after wave 30 or going endless until you lose, you can start to climb ascension levels. These are very classic ascension levels, with each level offering an additional challenge, like giving bosses unique powerful effects or buffing enemy health. I'm not entirely sure how many ascension levels there are, but I climbed a couple of them which offered a satisfying challenge. I think it's basically required to have some sort of difficulty level system if you have strong vertical progression, so I'm glad that it's here in this game. You can also unlock an easier difficulty if you die enough times, so that's a nice option as well for those that want that. So as a whole, the difficulty levels work, and I like them. You have a classic ascension difficulty level, modifiers, you have a fun endless mode, and you have a leaderboard to climb if you like that kind of competitive challenge. As a quick aside, there honestly isn't really any narrative or story in Nordhold, outside of a vaguely Norse theme that's easy to forget about, but as always, that's pretty standard for roguelites. So what's my verdict on Nordhold? As a whole, I liked it. The core tower defense elements were solid, the economic twist was great, and the progression, while heavy, felt satisfying in how it gradually revealed game mechanics to play around with. Because of those things, I recommend Nordhold if you're looking for a tower defense roguelite, as it's one of the better ones that I played. But it's not my number one in the genre because of some limitations on replayability. First, I really wish there's more banner variety for each tower. As it stands, it's functional, but you repeat them way too often, and I wish more fusions existed as well. Second, too much of that run variety is just choosing different towers to focus on. And finally, optimizing an opening felt great at first with that nice strategic planning element, but once I felt like I had locked in my opening, the initial waves began to feel much more repetitive, and I felt like my number of actual strategic choices went down. For all those reasons, Nordhold is a nice twist on roguelike tower defense games, but it has enough limitations to make it not for everyone. Huge shout out to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.